In this video, I'll be going through the events that led up to the First Crusade and the major battles that took place during the First Crusade. In the Middle Ages, Europe and the Middle East was divided between Christian and Muslim rule, and they weren't the friendliest of neighbors. They were constantly engaging in war. Alexius is the emperor of the Byzantine Empire through 1081 and 1118. He's important throughout the First Crusade. He has to deal with the major power struggle between the Seljuk Turks and the Byzantine Empire in the 11th century. The Seljuk Turks were a rising Muslim empire. They had originated from Central Asia and migrated south and converted to Sunni Islam. The Battle of Manzikert 1071 was between the Byzantine Empire and the Seljuk Turks. Now, this event was basically the leading clash between Christianity and Islam. The Seljuk Turks had launched an attack on the Byzantine Empire and won. And this victory was surprising for the Byzantine Empire, and the Turks just continued on and they conquered more of Byzantium land throughout Asia Minor. And this posed a threat to the Byzantine Empire, and Alexius knew that he had to do something in order to protect the Byzantine Empire. Alexius wrote to Pope Urban II in 1093 asking for his assistance, and he asked for his fellow Western European Christians to go into war with the Turks to reclaim the Holy Land. According to historians, they all agree that this is what he asked in the letter, although the letter was never restored in its original form. Pope Urban II used this appeal from Alexius as a chance to heal the rivalry between the Western Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox Church that the Great Schism of 1054 had caused. So, in 1095, Clermont, France, Pope Urban II gathered a sermon and he called on Christian knights to aid Byzantium. He made a desirable offer. He said that all the nomad sins would be forgiven if they were to fight for Christ. And for the nomads, this was the best deal in their eyes because this was basically a golden ticket to heaven just to fight for Christ. And this deal also had a deep interest from peasants and just townspeople. In fact, the American Historical Review by Oxford University gives credit, or at least the responsibility, of the First Crusade to Pope Urban II. I further researched the People's Crusade on Ancient History Encyclopedia. The People's Crusade was primarily led by Peter the Hermit and untrained peasants and regular townspeople. In fact, the People's Crusade was also known as the Peasants' Crusade, and they were not officially a part of the Knights. This group of peasants and noblemen and knights showed up to the border of Constantinople, and Alexius was surprised to see this group. It wasn't what he was expecting, and it's not what he asked for in the letter to Pope Urban II. And he did not allow them into Constantinople. Instead, he shipped them off to Asia Minor. Nicaea had been captured from the Byzantine Empire by the Turks in 1081, and they had formed the capital of Sultan of Rum. And in 1096, the People's Crusade attacked the Turks by surrounding the city. Although Alexius knew that this was a highly populated city with Christians, and he organized a surrender with the Turks without the knowledge of the Crusaders. With the Turks surrendering, the Crusaders discovered what Alexius did, and they were quite upset in hopes of them being able to destroy the city themselves. After this victory, the Crusaders split into two groups. One group led by Boehmed and Robert Cortes, and Raymond and Godfrey. Boehmed and Robert had set out one day ahead from their victory in Nicaea. They arrived on July 30th, 1097, and Boehmed ordered his men to put up a defense camp and at a stream to organize the cavalry for battle. And sure enough, July 1st, 1097, Sultan Ursulan attacked. Boehmed was ready, but things got bad quickly for the Crusaders. They were quickly losing men and horses, and Boehmed knew he had to change tactics to turn this around. So he ordered the knights to surround the border and keep up their shields, allowing supplies to come in. The Turks and Crusaders were head to head, and they were hot under the blazing hot sun. Although they were broken up by the second army that was a day behind them, led by Raymond and Godfrey, and they led their men to charge right into the Turks, and this had Sultan Ursulan panicked. Not knowing what to do, the remaining Turks ended up scattering around, and the Crusaders had won this battle. Before the Crusaders left onto the crusade, Alexis had them take an oath that any land that they would capture during this time would be given back to Alexis, as it was previously a part of the Byzantine Empire before being taken over by the Seljuk Turks. Although Baldwin did not honor this code, as he took over Edessa for his own personal gain. Ursulan used the scorched earth tactic, meaning he destroyed buildings, crops, or other resources that might be valuable to the invading enemy. And the Crusaders were affected because there weren't any food or supplies since the Turks had burned all of it. And they couldn't fight because they ended up being now malnourished by the lack of food because of the burning of crops. Although they were able to get to food because the Christian Armenians gave them food, so the Crusaders did not end up starving. When the Crusaders got to Antioch, they realized that the walls were high and there was really no way of getting in. The Crusaders formed a plan that they would block the gates of Antioch, and Bohemond and Robert went out for food as the Crusades were starving. And on their way out, they encountered a Muslim army, and neither Bohemond and Robert or the Muslim army was expecting each other. This was quite a surprise. Bohemond and Robert and their army fought the Muslim army, and the Muslim army ended up retreating. In Antioch, there were many earthquakes that left the Crusaders in panic, and the Bishop Amir followed up with a fast, and this allowed them to make it to spring because it was also spiritual and it allowed the longevity of food. Bohemond was able to bribe one of the guards and go into Antioch, which allowed the army to take over Antioch. And Bohemond also took over Antioch because he believed that he conquered it and it was his right, and he freed himself from the oath that he made to Alexis. January of 1099, the Crusaders left Antioch to Jerusalem. The Crusaders traveled through Syria and Palestine. It took the Crusaders 6 months to reach Jerusalem, from January to June. It is estimated about 15,500 men, 1,500 knights, and around 14,000 untrained men. The two men that led this siege was Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon. And the Crusaders used Italian and English ships to build siege towers, and they ultimately conquered Jerusalem in 1099, although this also had to do with the Muslims having their own problems. The Turks of Baghdad and the Turks of Asia Minor weren't getting along, and then there was also the Fatimids that weren't getting along. And this conquer was never really planned by Alexius, but he was honestly just content with the land that was conquered in Asia Minor. He didn't really care for Jerusalem, but he wasn't complaining about it either. And historians argue that the siege of Jerusalem marks the end of the First Crusade.